Hi, I'm Maya. Today I want to tell you a story. Not because I want pity, not because I want applause, because sometimes truth needs a calm voice. Not a headline, not a courtroom camera, just a voice that says, this happened. This is what I did about it. I was married to Drek for 7 years. To everyone else, he was polished, confident. The kind of man who walked into a room and made it feel smaller and brighter at once. People liked him. Journalists quoted him. Investors trusted him. My best friend, Olivia, was the kind of person who showed up at 2 a.m. with a box of tissues and a bad comedy. She knew my history, my little embarrassments, my mother's favorite recipes. She put band-aids on my knees and secrets into the safe corners of her mouth. I never imagined I would be the narrator of a story where those two names would make my own life fracture. But here I am, speaking into a microphone, breathing through each sentence, telling you how betrayal and justice braided into each other in my life. This is my story in 3 parts: the discovery, the rise, and the consequence. I'll begin at the moment everything started to change. The apartment was quiet that night. The rain had begun to soft patter against the balcony glass like a distant applause. I was on the floor. No, not dramatic, just tired, waiting. The kind of waiting that breeds small, restless gestures, hands that fold a magazine, the remote switched on and off. Drek was late again. He'd said he'd be home by 9. It was almost 11. So I took his tablet. Absurd, I know. But it had our streaming account still logged in, and I wanted to cue a show. I didn't mean to look. I didn't mean to find anything. Then the screen lit up with a message thread. Olivia. Her name in blue, and a preview line I read without thinking. A photo. 2 coffee mugs on a rooftop terrace. Drek's hand. Casual, relaxed, brushing the rim of one mug. The skyline blurred behind them. The caption, late night strategy. And 3 laugh emojis from Olivia. At first, I laughed too. Strained, incredulous. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was a work dinner. Maybe it was a city's palette of coincidences. But then there were more messages. More pictures. Plane tickets. Screenshots of hotel check-ins. A dinner receipt with a note. Olivia private consultation. Another message. Miss you. See you tomorrow. I felt something inside me turn very, very still. Not the cinematic scream. Not even the hot, sudden burn of rage I'd imagined in novels. It was quieter. It was emptier, like a room whose furniture had been packed away. When he finally walked in, late, smelling faintly of cologne and paper money, he asked me what was wrong. I put the tablet on the counter and pointed. I didn't need to say anything else. He watched the messages, watched my face, and his first instinct was to smile, like a reflex to protect himself. It was nothing, he said. It meant nothing, he said. He tried to explain it as if explanation could erect a bridge over the breach. He tried minimization. We were both lonely, it's complicated. And then he tried apology. The quick, slippery kind that arrives before remorse. Olivia texted me that night too. Maya, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean for this to happen. Her words were small, like a note pushed under a door. They didn't hold. They didn't stand. I packed 1 suitcase. I took the essentials. Clothes, a folder with documents that mattered at work, a photo that didn't sting. I left our apartment while Drek slept. I shut the door gently behind me. People imagine leaving as a dramatic slam. Mine was a quiet closing. It needed to be. I needed to be able to think. I stayed with a friend for a few nights. I didn't call my mother. I didn't post anything. I did something else. Something that surprised even me. I began to look at Drek's world as if it were a puzzle I had the right to solve. I work in finance. I analyze risk. I untangle numbers. It's what I do. When you spend years looking for small mismatches on balance sheets, you acquire a kind of intuition. And this intuition started to whisper. Something in Drek's firm, Orion Financial, was off. At first, it was a hunch. A loose thread. Vendors paid with odd descriptors. Transfers timed at curious hours. A client report with numbers that didn't match the supporting schedules. The kind of things people explain away with a lazy shrug until the shrug becomes an avalanche. I didn't want revenge. I didn't want to humiliate him. I wanted truth. I wanted protection for the people who trusted what he'd built. And admit it. I wanted to rebuild my own sense of control, so I started to gather information. Quietly, professionally. Like someone mounting a case that had to be unassailable, I reached out to a former colleague who owed me a favor. I spoke in guarded sentences. I hired independent auditors under the pretense of offering the company consulting outreach. The board accepted. It was less scandal to call me a consultant than to ask the public why their numbers seemed off. I walked into Orion Financial not as a betrayed spouse, but as a professional. I wore a simple black blazer and a face that had practiced neutrality. The office smelled of citrus cleaner and ambition. The entry atrium had orchids and a glass sculpture that reflected light in 1,000 strategic angles. I made an agreement. I would lead a routine stabilization and compliance review. They gave me access because they believed me to be a non-threatening expert, and I did my work. Numbers, as they say, never lie. Only people misinterpret them. The deeper we dug, the more the pattern revealed itself. Circular transfers through holding companies, invoices issued for consultations that were never performed, expense accounts that fed into other expense accounts until the origin point was indistinguishable from the destination. And in the middle of those lines, again and again, was a name, Drek. Olivia's initials surfaced on a handful of documents. Approvals for travel, sign-offs on consultancy retainers. They were small things in isolation. But when you place small things side by side, like the loose stones in a decorative wall, they form a crack. I didn't act out of rage. I acted out of method. I compiled the findings. I organized them like evidence in a court, and then I presented them. To the board, to compliance, to outside counsel. There was an odd moment of silence in the boardroom after I finished. Men and women with practiced faces shifted. Paper shuffled. A gaze landed on the executive chair where Drek usually presided. No one had to speak to say what everyone already knew. The breach was bigger than an affair. By the time I left that room, things had begun to move in a direction none of us had planned. The first domino had been nudged. Power is funny. It looks like confidence, but it's usually thinly layered uncertainty. When the audit files opened, Drek tried first to charm. He called old allies. He made the phone round of investors who once shared golf rounds and weekend dinners. He walked the halls of Orion like a man asserting territory he feared losing. I remember the day he was suspended. He came to the office with a newspaper under his arm and a smile sharpened for press. He entered the boardroom, sat down, and began to talk about brand, reputation, and temporary distractions. I watched him from the edge of the table. I sat straight and neutral and let the auditors speak, the evidence. Dates, wire transfers, shell company names spoke loudly. The board voted in a hush. Drek was suspended pending formal investigation. There was a particular look on his face, the flicker of disbelief like a man who thinks some laws apply to others. He tried to push back. He hired expensive lawyers. He leaked a story to a journalist about a personal campaign. He framed me as the vengeful mistress of corporate sabotage. The narrative was small. It needed to be loud to drown the documents. But the paper trail held. As the investigation widened, more details emerged. Shell entities in 2 countries. A network of transfers timed with market movements. Just before bad news to cover losses. Just after good news to siphon gains. Contracts for strategic advisory that paid into accounts with no operating addresses. Olivia's name kept surfacing. Not as a mastermind, at least not on paper, but as someone who had authorized small, convenient things that hid in accounting footnotes. The firm's PR person wrote statements. Investors filed emergency requests. Regulators opened inquiries. The media, hungry for a story that combined sex and scandal and money, arrived in that particular flavor of intensity that equates visibility with guilt. Olivia called me. She left me messages that threaded shame and pleading. "Maya, please. We can talk. I never meant," she said in one. In another, "I'm so sorry. I wish I could turn back time." I listened to those messages in a hotel room for a week before I answered. When I finally did, my voice was calm. "Olivia," I said, "I'm not here for apologies. I'm here for facts." Her silence after that call was loud. Board meetings multiplied. Lawyers recommended freezing accounts. Senior staffers who had once eaten at Drek's table came to me with rumors, confessions, and whispers. Junior employees whose pensions had been misallocated sent me private emails. A receptionist who had cried in my arms about being denied a promotion sent me a spreadsheet of missing payroll entries. There is an awkward moral complexity in this work. I had to separate the private hurt from the public duty. I had to ensure fairness even as I felt a personal revulsion. I refused to let my pain drive indictments. I insisted on hard evidence. That insistence is what saved me from becoming the person the tabloids claimed I was. And slowly, the firm's power structure shifted. The board needed someone to steady things. Someone with a reputation for honesty and a voice the market would listen to. Rumors began to swirl, quietly at first, that I might be offered a leadership role. I didn't plan it. I didn't scheme for it. It unfolded because in the vacuum of failing leadership, people look for steady hands. The first day I walked into the executive suite as acting CEO, I felt a strange mixture, impatience and grave responsibility. The suite smelled of espresso machines and the hum of air conditioning. The portraits on the wall were of men whose names I'd read and respected. I closed the door behind me and sat at the desk. Drek's chair had an indentation where he always leaned, the leather slightly worn. I ran my hand over it, and for a moment the personal and the professional overlapped in a way that made my throat tight. Then I stood, walked to the window, and looked at the city. There was no satisfaction. There was work. Contracts to sift, teams to reassure, clients to meet. There was also consequence. The legal system began to move. Regulators received the audit package. Subpoenas were issued. Drex accounts were frozen. Investors sought restitution. And as the legal net tightened, Drex's confidence crumbled into a series of small, petulant acts. Angry pressers, slurred defenses on morning shows, attempts to intimidate witnesses that fell flat. Olivia watched the fallout. Social media, fast to elevate and faster to abandon, began to show a different reflection. Friends she had brunch with now avoided her stories. Family dinners that once included her laughter now featured discussions in which her name was a source of careful silence. She sent me one desperate message. My mother asked me to stay away. She's ashamed. One line that told me everything. Not everyone is punished by law. Sometimes social exile is a punishment of quieter cruelty. There were smaller, human tragedies embedded in this scandal. A junior analyst discovered that part of her retirement portfolio had vanished into a shell company. An older client, retired, trusting, found discrepancies in his account statements. A young woman in compliance who had tried to raise concerns months ago was told to calm down by a senior partner. I wrote to each of them. I offered support. We set up employee relief funds. We opened a channel so people could report without fear. I worked days that blurred into nights. Meetings ended, and an inbox greeted me like a tide. Urgent, merciless. Sleep came in stolen naps. But the steady forward of action. Hiring forensic accountants, restructuring the compliance team, presenting transparent updates to clients. Felt like an antidote to the chaos. In private, I had to reconcile what I had done with what I had lost. There was no small, neat victory in seeing Drek humiliated. There was only the consequence of his choices. That consequence came at a cost. Not least to the family who had once celebrated him. People don't always get tidy endings. Trials turn human stories into ledger lines, counts, exhibits, witness lists. But for those of us in the center, it is a messy, slow folding of consequence. The prosecution was methodical. They laid out the money flows like a map: source, transfer, shelter, distribution. Forensic accountants testified. Emails were read aloud. Standing in a courtroom watching your former husband's signature appear on documents you'd once believed were about strategy and growth felt like watching an old photograph burn slowly. Drek's defense tried to disrupt the map with narratives. It was a misunderstanding. These are standard industry practices. My client never intended to. It's striking how often the word intend appears when people are asking forgiveness for choices that benefited them. In the end, the law does not ask about intent in a vacuum. It looks at actions, patterns, and consequences. Drek faced charges: money laundering, falsification of corporate records, conspiracy. The sentence was not only punitive, it was educational. Restitution orders, community service, and a period where corporate positions were legally closed to him. He called once, months into the process, into the void of my life. He asked for a meeting. He wanted to explain. He wanted to cry. He wanted to beg. I refused, not from cruelty, but from deliberation. Some doors, once closed, are best left that way to protect new structures you are building. Olivia's life contracted. She did not face prison. She faced solitude. Her mother, who had once been a second mother to me, stopped answering texts. Her close friends stopped inviting her to reunions. At first, it was polite. We're giving space. Then it changed into omission. She was absent from group photos. Her name stopped circulating in the usual chats. Social exile is its own justice sometimes. A quiet, corrosive consequence that can last longer than any sentence. She moved to a smaller apartment. She started offering event coordination for boutique clients who preferred discretion. She sought therapy. She tried to make amends in ways that mattered to those she had hurt, but she found that some doors never reopen. Forgiveness, she learned, is often conditional. It's a currency people spend with caution. As for me, I had to reimagine what victory meant. I could have gnashed my teeth publicly. I could have taken to stages and screamed of vindication. Instead, I chose work. I rebuilt Orion with a series of practical, sometimes painful policies. We set up a whistleblower hotline. We funded audits for clients who'd been affected. We restructured executive review processes so no one person could manipulate the ledger. We also invested in people. We created a relief fund for employees who suffered losses. We had open sessions where staff could voice concerns. The culture change was the slowest and the most meaningful thing I oversee. Changing policy is hours on paper. Changing culture is slow, stubborn sunlight. I started therapy. I learned to sit with grief without allowing it to become a daily companion. I took long runs at dawn and kept a notebook where I wrote small, unedited sentences. I made new friends. People who were good at small, sustaining kindnesses. I dated once, hesitantly, and realized I was more interested in coffee than declarations. I learned to love the quiet rituals of a life not defined by another's choices. There was an internal ceremony when the new compliance plaque was installed in the atrium. Someone, no longer Drek, had suggested the words integrity first. It sounded corporate when read aloud by a PR person. To me, it felt like a promise etched in cool metal. I stood there, fingers on the letters, and thought of how much ordinary work it takes to make a promise real. The nights of sorting accounts, the phone calls to clients, the small kindnesses to employees who had been frightened. Do I feel triumphant? Sometimes. Do I still ache? Often. The ache is a useful thing. It reminds me that love matters. It reminds me that trust is not trivial. People often ask, would you want them punished? Do you want revenge? The answer is complicated. I wanted accountability. I wanted restitution for those harmed. I wanted to protect others. I did not want to become a person who alphabetized her life around someone else's shame. A year later, Drek is a cautionary note in someone else's conversation. Olivia is rebuilding small things in quiet rooms. I run a company that is less flashy and more honest. I mentor a few young women in finance, teaching them not just how to read a balance sheet, but how to protect their integrity when the world asks for something else. Here is what I learned, and I want to say it plainly. Betrayal will try to define you. It will whisper that you are broken, but you are not defined by someone else's choices. You can grieve. You can rage. You can even want revenge. But then, if you choose, you can work. Not to be less human, but to be more deliberate. If you are listening, if you are the one who left with a suitcase and a bruised heart, know this. The quiet acts you take after the breaking are the stitches that hold you. They are what rebuild the house of your life. I still read old messages sometimes. I still let the memory of that rooftop photo settle into my chest like a small stone. But then I let it go. I let it teach me where I had been naive. I let it remind me why I now ask questions. Loud, annoying, inconvenient questions. Whenever something in a ledger doesn't make sense. That is my story. Not a perfect ending. Not a fairy tale. But a path. Thank you for listening.